Hello, everyone. Welcome. I think we lost my screen share. One second. All right. I believe everybody is seeing the screen. Give me a thumbs up, please. But welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Nicole. I am serving as a community manager for Opportunity at Work's STARS Public Sector Hub. And today's webinar topic is lessons from implementing skills-based hiring in the federal government. We are so grateful to be joined today by the Partnership for Public Service, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization on a mission to build a better government and a stronger democracy. And they have invited some incredible subject matter experts who will share their insights from the federal government perspective. You will be receiving a quick poll on your screen. We'd love to learn more about who is in the room and how you heard about this event. So please take a second to complete this poll. Today's agenda includes a brief overview of Opportunity at Work and the STARS Public Sector Hub. Then we will turn it to the Partnership for Public Service. You'll hear from Jenny Mattingly for a policy overview of skills-based hiring in the federal government. Next, Michelle Amante is going to lead a panel discussion with two guests, Assistant Commissioner Andrea Bright with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and Will Slack, formerly with the U.S. Digital Service, and he's joining us in a personal capacity today. After the panel, we will open it up to our questions from you. And throughout this webinar, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. And Michelle is going to be lifting up questions from that at the end of the presentation. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a copy of the recording and other assets afterwards. A quick overview of our mission at Opportunity at Work. We are a nonprofit focused on ensuring that STARS, or workers skilled through alternative routes rather than a bachelor's degree, can reach their full potential. STARS are a talent category with over 70 million US workers, and STARS have gained their skills through routes such as community college, military service, workforce training programs, or through work experience on the job. STARS are a vital part of the public sector workforce, as there are over 9 million STARS in federal, state, and local government today. Of course, we'd love to see that number rise even higher, so we want to equip you with skills-based strategies and resources to help you access more STARS. To that end, we launched the STARS Public Sector Hub back in May. So about 4 months in, and it is a digital resource hub designed for public sector leaders, including at the state, local, and federal levels. Some of our core value propositions are our data, research, and narrative design. Our webpage hosts lots of great resources. But beyond that, the hub is also a learning community. We are building this network so we can all learn from one another about how to advance skills-first practices and activate STAR talent. If you have not already joined the hub, we invite you to join us so that you'll have full access to our exclusive events and are in the know about our latest tools and resources. We'll drop the link in the chat, and we'll also share in our follow-up email. Membership is free, and any employee of a public sector entity is welcome to join the hub as a member. And for folks on this call who do not work for a government entity, there's also an opportunity for nonprofits to join us as a partner. There's a short interest form on our website. We review those on a quarterly basis to determine alignment with moving the public sector forward with skills first hiring. So again, if you haven't signed up, please join the hub. And as part of the hub, we host a series of regular webinars and office hours and create space for community gathering. We really value your input and feedback about what your needs and interests are so that we can provide the content and resources that you need. Our webinar series results from our conversations with public sector leaders to understand their goals and challenges with workforce planning and skills-based practices. So this chart on the left is from a survey that we did with public sector leaders. We found that there were many areas where support is needed, and one of those areas that surfaced was creating a skills-based culture within their organization. So how do you educate internal leaders and colleagues about skills-based practices? How do you create buy-in, et cetera? So through this webinar series, we aim to help your organization with that culture change. And here is our calendar of events for the remainder of the year. On our website, we have registration links for each of these events, and we'll share them in our recap email as well. So coming up on October 24th, we will host a follow-up office hours to today's webinar where we're bringing back the Partnership for Public Service. It's an opportunity to ask deeper questions with our subject matter experts more informally, and also you'll meet other members of the Hub community. And then in November and December, we're partnering with the Cicero Institute, a nonpartisan policy organization focused on fixing broken systems in the public sector. So we'll be exploring lessons from the groundbreaking work that happened at the state of Maryland to remove degree requirements from thousands of their job openings, which inspired over 20 additional states to take actions to implement skills-based hiring. All right, so here are the incredible people you'll be meeting with throughout today's webinar. You'll hear from Jenny Mattingly, Vice President of Government Affairs at the Partnership for Public Service, Michelle Monte, Vice President, Federal Workforce Programs at the Partnership for Public Service, Assistant Commissioner Andrea Bright with the Office of Human Resource Management, Enterprise Services at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and finally, Will Slack, civic technologist and former team lead for hiring at the U.S. Digital Service. So I'll now pass it to Jenny to take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Nicole, and hello, everyone. Great to be here today, and big thanks to our friends at Opportunity at Work for inviting us to talk about skills-based hiring in the federal government. This is one of my favorite topics, trying to bring in qualified applicants to the government and trying to help hiring managers and HR do that work in a skills-first manner. So what I want to do today is share a little bit about who I am, what we're going to talk about, and really set the frame, the stage for where skills-based hiring is currently in the federal government. And so I had the opportunity, been at the Partnership for Public Service for about 2 years. And for the 2 years prior to that, I had the opportunity to work with Will, who's on the panel today, really working on some hiring reform and hiring pilots to try to bring assessments, skills-based hiring to the federal hiring process. And so certainly something that we saw some lessons learned, and you'll hear more about those today. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about skills-based hiring and where that sort of really started over the last couple years. And so if we can go to the next slide, today I will cover the executive order that was put into place in 2020, the SMEQA pilot, subject matter expert qualification assessments, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit more following this. And then the most recent OPM OMB memo on improving the federal hiring experience, because each of those plays a part in agencies starting to move towards this skills-based hiring culture that Nicole talked about just a minute ago. And so we can go to the next slide. I'll talk about the executive order in a minute, but first sort of wanted to give you a typical hiring process that you probably hear state and local. We certainly hear it at the federal level quite a bit, is that typically when you talk to folks about hiring experience, you have HR sifting through hundreds of applications. Applicants kind of take a self-assessment questionnaire where they self-select what their skill level is, not having it all the way to expert. And then hiring managers end up with hiring certs or lists of unqualified candidates. And oftentimes the hiring action ends with no selection. Not a great outcome for anybody in that process. And so the other story we hear a lot too is people are hiring technologists for many new jobs across the government. And what happens is there are a lot of applicants who maybe don't have a 4-year degree, but they got their technology skills through boot camps, through some other mechanism, a 2-year degree, but they don't qualify for jobs because of that 4-year degree requirement. So that's those two challenges are part of what led into the executive order that you see here on the screen. I actually not going to read it to you. This is language that comes directly from the executive order, and it's in the chat too. Thank you, Henry. A link if you want to click on it and read more about it. And so the executive order in 2020 under the Trump administration really focused on trying to remove the minimum education requirements unless a job actually needs them, and really to move agencies away from using this self-assessment questionnaire, which isn't a very good indicator of where a person's skills, actually a candidate's skills, are for the job. And so this executive order set into motion some work under both the Trump administration that was carried into the Biden administration. And one of those things was this pilot project called SMEQA, which I mentioned, and that's on the next slide, please. And so the subject matter expert qualifications assessment work, and it was also through the PMA, the President's Management Agenda. And I've pulled some things that come from some SMEQA documents here so you can see it. And what it really focused on was bringing subject matter experts into the process in a more intentional way, because they often know what skills are needed. They can help HR sift through resumes and identify qualified candidates. And then it also brought into place multiple hurdle assessments. So really trying to figure out over the course of the hiring process what skills people have, regardless of what it says on the resume, but really putting them through technical and applications of their skills, and then working to make sure that hiring managers have a piece of this process as well and are really engaged in it, so that we get a list of qualified applicants at the end. And so I'm sure you'll hear more about this as our panelists keep talking, but there were several pilots run in different agencies across government, and more, it ended with a little bit of work being done at the OPM level and also in individual agencies level. At Office of Personnel Management, OPM, they put into place the hiring experience group, which is actually working on and with agencies to continue to move towards the skills-based hiring, similar to what we saw in SMEQA, but just more broadly as well. And we can go to the next slide, please. And the final piece that I'll share, and all these are linked in the slides and then in the chat as well, is the recent memo from August of this year. Office of Personnel Management and Office of Management and Budget jointly issued it for agencies. And again, I pulled language directly from it that you can read, but really trying to lean into some of the principles and drive more of this culture and practice across agencies around workforce planning, around making sure that applicants are being rated on their skills, that they're using assessments through agencies, and really trying to make sure that hiring managers are getting lists of candidates who are qualified for the positions to which they're applying to. So this memo, again, is only a couple months old. It builds on work that's already ongoing in federal agencies, but that work also still has a lot to go to get to, I think, what the vision is of really using assessments all the time. And there are some challenges that agencies face around making sure they have the budget for assessments, really encouraging subject matter experts in HR to be involved in the process all the way, making sure hiring managers and HR talk about what skills are needed for each job. So there are a lot of challenges, but a lot of good lessons learned that you'll hear from as well. And so what's next in this after this slide? We can go to the final slide, please. Is there a lot of things that agencies have to start learning and scaling up this work? And I've shared some OPM resources here that are in the hiring memo. If you click on the link in the chat, you'll see links to these. But there's FAQs, there's a workforce planning guide. One thing I do want to highlight where federal government is working toward is this agency talent portal. It's a portal for agencies to go in, hiring managers and HR, to see resumes of people who are interested in different types of positions across the government. There are also certs or lists of candidates from pooled hiring actions, something we were also trying to do, which is to say, if we're going to go through assessments and hire, say, a cybersecurity specialist, those skills are largely the same across agencies. So can we assess everybody at one time? OPM often runs these pooled hiring actions. They put the candidates through assessments, sometimes a multiple hurdle process like SMEQA, and then they come up with a pool of candidates that any agency can make selections off of. So great for applicants because they are assessed once and then can be considered by many agencies. Great for hiring managers because they can come in, see a pool of qualified applicants, and just look for ones that are good fits for their needs in their agency. And then there are a couple of trainings and resources that OPM has that I link to start helping hiring managers and HR specialists think about the skills first hiring, particularly around assessments and using data and doing the planning for this. And so sharing those, just because it's new, not everyone has seen them yet. But I think those really set the stage for where we're going. And part of what we've been thinking about at the partnership too, as we think about these skills-based hiring policies, is where are the low-hanging fruit that agencies can get started? We hear all the time agencies saying, how do I start this? But there are things in the memo around writing good job announcements that are clear, that speak to applicants, really identifying the skills and updating position descriptions for jobs. So those are some of the baseline things for skills-based hiring that, we've been talking to agencies about. So I'll pause there because you're going to hear a lot more about this. And I think I turn it over to my colleague, Michelle Amante, who's our Vice President for Workforce, and is going to walk you through the next part.
Jenny, thank you so much for that important grounding for our upcoming conversation with Andrea and Will. So excited to have both of you join us today to share your experience and your knowledge in this space. Will, Jenny teed you up a little bit in her conversation, so I'm going to start with you. So why don't you share with our viewers today your experience with skills-based hiring?
Yeah, so I have been working at the U.S. Digital Service and was asked to join the team that was implementing SMEQA, what Jenny said, that's a big long word that just means subject matter experts doing the qualification assessments versus that happening via other processes. And coming into that world, just realized at the federal space, we had a lot of hiring that was happening without really looking at candidates' backgrounds and experiences. And so people that were hiring managers were receiving lists of candidates and then saying, I can't really hire off this list. This list isn't working because the qualification assessment piece wasn't functioning in a good way. I think we have many people on the HR side joining us for the webinar right now. I'm sure that you have experienced hiring managers that say, you're not giving me a good list, while they're also not really helping you in making sure that list is good. So we implemented SMEQA as a way to bring the HR professionals and the hiring manager together to work more effectively as a pair, instead of a world where HR is kind of charged with doing a hiring work, doesn't have the support it needs, and then hiring managers can't really use those lists. So how do we put those people in the same room? You put them in the same room, you do some of the processes that we'll talk about, and you can end up with a much more productive cert. We ran pilots for this across many agencies and showed it worked every time. Every time we were able to hire multiple candidates that agencies were very happy with and that were able to be successful in their hiring, where previously they had made like 2 or 3 runs at hiring a role and then that was never successful. With this process, they were able to have success. And it was a real pleasure to work with those agencies in doing so. Happy to share the lessons learned.
Thank you, Will. Andrea, I want to pass it to you because I want to talk a little bit about, in your role at Customs and Border Protection, your assistant commissioner, you lead all of HR there. Like, how is CBP approaching skills-based hiring?
So for us, it's a little bit different just because of the volume of applicants that we have. And we're also largely hiring in a law enforcement environment. We have a lot of jobs. We hire everything. If you can think of a job, chances are we have 66,000 employees. So a lot of different jobs. But in the law enforcement arena and in what we call our mass hiring, we've had for years a really strong assessment approach. So some of the things that Jenny was talking about, we use assessments. Some of them are multiple choice. Some of them are scenario based. We have on board in CBP, and this is one of those things that if you're going to develop assessments, you have some different options. And OPM's guidance provides information about, where you can go to get resources. But for us, we have in-house industrial organizational psychologists who are on board, who can develop custom assessments for us for those large volumes of hiring that we do. So we have multiple choice types of assessments. We do writing skills tests, and we do for our promotions in basket simulations. So if you can think of as a manager, you know, I have an inbox. Okay, we don't have inboxes these days anymore, but in the old world, we had inboxes where all of the requests for the day would come in, and you would, you know, they would be pieces of paper. Now it's all email, right? But whatever that is in the new world, we do a simulation of that for our promotional exams, where we've gathered information about what is it actually like, what types of documents might somebody be reviewing and making decisions on. So, because the truth is, it's really, you know, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, which is, I think, sort of where Will was going. Is it's not whether you have a degree or not, it's whether you can do the job, and your experience demonstrates, you know, you've done something similar. And so having those skills and competencies that underlie that is really the key. It's not the degree. A degree may be one way to demonstrate knowledge, but there are a whole lot of other ways that you can gain those skills and competencies. And it's, from my experience, actually assessing whether someone can do the job and whether they have the skills is the best way to make sure you have qualified people when you get to the point of actually hiring.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense, particularly with the population that you're trying to hire. What have been some of your biggest challenges with, you know, building on assessments and maybe creating new ones and thinking about this population of folks?
So one of the challenges, and I think somebody mentioned this a little bit earlier, is leadership buy-in. We have leadership buy-in to a skills-based approach, but one of the challenges for us is, and it's probably true for any organization, as you have leadership turnover, everyone has opinions about how people should be assessed, and, you know, they want to tweak this or that, and instead of doing this type of test, you know, they hear from somebody that, you know, something. And so as making sure that you have continuity across leadership can sometimes be a challenge. And so making sure that you, as you have leadership turnover, are explaining and early on what your assessment approach is, I think is helpful, because you give them the information, you give them the data, and then they're better informed at the beginning. I think the other big challenge is really about, it's about the investment, frankly. We're a large organization, and like I said, we have industrial organizational psychologists. But I will say there are off-the-shelf assessments you can do, and you can do things like the SMEQA that doesn't require it doesn't require a ton of, you know, data. And, you know, I think that there's sort of a continuum of where you go in terms of assessments and investment, and it depends on the volume of applicants, the type of jobs that you're hiring, really in terms of your return on that investment. But I think that's a big challenge. And the other thing is applicants' expectations about what the hiring process is. To your point earlier, I think Jenny said, you know, in the federal government, we've had these self-assessment rating questionnaires, you know, rate yourself 1 to 5 on how good you are at whatever it is. And applicants are a little resistant to actually taking an assessment. They expect to just be able to take the questionnaire online. And so adding those phases to the hiring process can meet some resistance from applicants. So being upfront about that. We provide online assessment guides on our website so that people know up front. We're not trying to trick anyone. We're just trying to give them the best opportunity to demonstrate that they can do the job. So we want them to be prepared.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly sounds like a best practice. You know, Andrea, you alluded to there being kind of there's a maturity model for assessments and for growth in this space. Well, there's lots of interest in this, right? I don't know that I've talked to any leaders in HR that aren't interested in doing this or don't have a passion for getting this going, but it can be overwhelming knowing where to start. So what's your best advice for some leaders who really want to dive into this space, but don't necessarily have the resources or the experience behind them yet?
Well, the first thing I would say is that when you want to try or pilot these practices, it is not something that requires you to spend months and months and months building a pilot. You can just gather some people that really know about the work, really know about the jobs required in that work, and run a job analysis workshop. And you can say, what are the tasks required to do this work? What are the skill sets that lead to those tasks? And then how can we ask questions in a structured interview to assess those skills? We did those workshops with IO psychologists sitting in the back, but they didn't have to really take an active role because that's very clear evidence about, okay, I can answer this question successfully about what it takes to do the job. That means the assessment has validity. It is something that, to Andrea's point, you can't automate a structured interview. So that's something that you can do as a first pilot to show, oh, this does work. But when you get those people in the room together, when you have HR and the subject matter experts there in the same place, sometimes you're going to find some really low-hanging fruit, because it may not be that your organization has a practice of debriefing how well the hiring process is working. Is HR if you're, HR, you may not be getting the feedback from your hiring managers, hey, we're not seeing this skill set, we're missing this piece. And sometimes just getting folks in the room together for 2 hours, we would hear stories of all the SMEs are saying, yeah, you really need this skill. And HR says, I didn't know that. And that is something you can check for in a resume. So just a little bit of helping to cross the streams or break the silos can be really high value. And then, yeah, if you do one of those workshops, you can write an interview script. You can then run that in your next hiring process, and you could have a hire within 5 weeks. That was something that we demoed and did successfully multiple times. I also it is something that takes time. And so when you're thinking about when and how to do this, it's not something I would try to implement across an entire organization first. I would try to doing it in a role that you're having challenges, where your hiring managers are saying, hey, I'm not getting the people that I need. And you can say, okay, well, let's put some skin in the game from your side. And you can actually be involved in the process of creating an assessment and then running an assessment. And that will both mean that the subject matter experts now understand the challenges of HR, which sometimes are not well understood. And your hiring manager can say, okay, this is what it means to be involved. I really need to do a better job of recruiting. Because if you don't do a good job recruiting, then the assessment process is not going to produce gold. You have to have that coming in the door the first time. And when you involve people and make it everyone's challenge together, you end up finding more success. And that's what we saw multiple times.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I want to remind the viewers that the Q&A is open, and if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to enter them, and I'm monitoring that. Andrea, one of the many reasons why I thought you'd be a perfect panelist is that I know CBP tracks data, right? And you have great analysts and you're looking at your data constantly. So talk to me about how you're using data analytics in these assessment processes, and how do you use them to change and iterate?
So for us, we gather feedback from our applicants, whether they're people coming from outside or those who are internal who are applying for promotions. We collect feedback throughout the hiring process. And it's actually something that we've been adding more and more to the process, hoping that we don't annoy people, but we really want to get their feedback throughout the process, not just at the end, because frankly, sometimes at the end you've forgotten what happened along the way. So I'm just going to throw out there for those of you who are applying for jobs, when you get those requests for feedback and surveys from agencies or private sector companies who are asking for your feedback about the hiring process, I'm going to put in a plug for respond to them, because that's how they iterate, is based on that type of feedback. And then on the assessment side, technically, we conduct job analysis periodically. So we update our job analyses to make sure that the job hasn't changed, because frankly, jobs change all the time. And so we do full-blown job analyses periodically, but we also meet with our program offices. As Will was just saying, sometimes when you talk to them, they go, oh, well, you know what? Yeah, I get that you were testing for that, but guess what? They don't actually do math anymore, because now all of that is automated, and you're, as an assessment person, you're like, oh no, we've been assessing people on math. We need to update our job analysis. So you really need to keep that feedback loop tight in terms of surveys, but also just talking to people. And then we do validation studies. So periodically we do validation studies to make sure that the people who we are selecting are the best people for the job. So there's a formal process that our IO psychologists will go through to make sure that our assessments are valid, because occasionally, for better or worse, we get challenged on the process, and so we need to have those studies and the technical reports and all of the data to defend our processes and make sure that what we're doing is really job related, ties back to the job analysis and the requirements of the job.
Yeah, that makes sense. Will, you alluded to, or you talked a minute ago about like the importance of the relationships, internal relationships between HR and hiring managers and recruiters. And I would throw probably EEO in there too. And like those offices need to work really seamlessly together to have this optimal hiring process. Are there other relationships or partnerships that agencies and organizations should be thinking about to really launch an initiative like this successfully?
I think when looking at relationships, it's also worth looking at incentives. And oftentimes we look at our folks in HR and we say, are you following the right process? And you are not really rewarded if a great hire is made, but we do ding you if there's something that goes wrong process-wise. Whereas the hiring manager owns the full kind of like, if it's a good hire, that hiring manager has a great time. If it's a bad hire, they have a poor time. When those incentives are separate, it makes that relationship challenging. So how can we be in a place where the hiring manager sees maintaining a good process is something that is an important part of their job? And how can we reward HR or reward a recruiter and say, hey, you did a great job recruiting someone that's really fitting well for this role, and help those incentives get people aligned? I think when you look at the kind of executive managers, when we think about the time that we spend interviewing candidates, sometimes there's a mismatch between what we might see in industry and what we might see in the nonprofit or public sector, where we're not asking people to spend the same time helping with the hiring. And when we do ask for that time, it's perceived as like a cost that's taking away from mission.
Mhm.
That time that a subject matter expert spends talking to candidates and asking them questions is very valuable time. It helps them understand, okay, here's who's applying to this role. It helps make the hiring manager a better recruiter. It's giving the people that work at your organizations direct exposure to the people who might want to do that work. That can improve things, but it means you have to ask for and receive permission to say, we're going to spend an hour less a day when we're doing this hiring effort on, work directly to the mission, and we're going to be spending time making sure we have the people that we need for the mission. And that requires you to create some space, not being in a world where someone can only do this, from 5 to 6 p.m. after they've done their full day of meetings.
Right.
It takes time to interview people, and you have to be able to process that. So that's the biggest relationship, is making that time so that people can spend the time they need on assessments.
We do have a question in the chat, and Andrea, I'm going to direct this to you. It says, what tips do you have for applicants to use in creating their resume to illustrate their skills? Should there be a different way to do a resume to match the skills-based hiring approach?
I'm going to give you my answer, and then I wonder if Will and I have the same answer. So I don't know that there's necessarily a different way of doing it. I will say sometimes I see in resumes. So we talk in the federal government, and especially in the leadership and executive space, about the CCAR method or the STAR method, or however you want to put it, but about in your executive core qualifications write-up, you're supposed to talk about the challenge, the context, your action, and the result. And my 2 cents about resumes is try to do something similar. So make sure that if there are skills that they are looking for a particular job, say they're looking for problem solving or decision making, make sure that you actually have things in your resume that show that. And because sometimes you just see, I will say, tasks, and it's a little bit hard sometimes for hiring managers to figure out, first of all, what you did versus what the group did. Or sometimes you see results without activities. And so I would think of that STAR type of approach, like there was, something, and I always I did this and here's the result. At least for me, that helps a little bit because I can figure out and try to, which is what you do, try to interpret what skills there are. I know that some people put headings of skills. I don't know. That's personally, as a hiring manager, I'm not a huge fan of that. I don't know.
Will, anything to add from your experience?
Yeah, I absolutely agree on, we will see people sometimes talk about the roles they had or what their team did and not saying, this is not a time to be shy. Like, take the credit for the things that you did, and make sure those verbs are central. Like, I solved a problem when. A way you might do that is to look at a job announcement and it's saying, here are the qualifications we're looking for, and just ask yourself the question, when have I practiced qualification X? And then answer it and make sure that answer is present in the resume. But that's a claim to a skill. It's different than assessing to see if that skill is there. But make sure you're claiming, I have done this thing in a specific way, ideally talking about the outcomes. So situation was X, I did Y, outcome was Z. And I would never use the verb consulted. People talk about all the time, like, I consult. That doesn't mean anything. Like, talk about, what did you actually do? I authored this proposal. I reviewed this, what is the thing and what was the outcome?
Excellent. We have another question in the chat. The question says, how are job descriptions defined for skills-based hiring? So I think getting at are they different? Are job descriptions different now than they were before, maybe when they were more focused on degree-based requirements? Any thoughts on that, Will?
I would say there's kind of two different pieces here. One is that we're talking about, what are the things that you're doing in the job? So can we make sure that people know the job consists of doing this kind of work? And then another piece would be, here are the qualifications that we look for to do that work. And so one of them is going to help you know, is this the right job for me in terms of what I'll be doing? But also, am I bringing the right skill sets to bear and looking at those pieces? And I think that qualification section, at least in federal hiring, is very important. The government is not hiding the ball. There's no secret criteria that is not being listed. It's there, but you need to be specific in saying, this is how I have that. This is how I know I did that. And just be really brass tacks clear. When you're not clear, you sound like someone else that is trying to kind of elevate themselves a little bit with a cloud. So be really specific about what you did, and then trust that the process will say, yes, you have the skill set, or no, you don't.
Andrea, at CBP have job descriptions, and this is more the announcement side. Have they evolved over time as you are focusing more on assessments and skills-based hiring?
I will say they are slowly evolving. So we have what I was talking about, our mass hiring. When we're hiring Border Patrol agents or customs, what you all think of as customs officers, those types of jobs, we're hiring, hundreds of people at a time, or hopefully thousands. But those are a little different from and those are, I think everyone knows, and we have tons of information about those jobs that are pretty clear. The ones that are more challenging for us, and I think across the federal government, are what we think of as management types of jobs. The management analysts. We have a lot of management analysts or program managers, and when you look on USA Jobs across the board for the federal government, those are really squishy announcements, and that has been a challenge for us that we are trying to address. And again, working closely with hiring managers to say, okay, we have the description of the job, but how would you say it in a way that an applicant would actually understand what you do? Because they tend to be fuzzy and say, things like that they'll be analyzing programs and evaluating progress and reporting, but there's a difference between doing that. If it's I don't know, I'm trying to think of something. If it's a human resources program, or if you're doing it in a healthcare context, or if you're doing it in, those may matter to applicants because they're really interested or passionate about something. And so we're trying to get more specific in our job announcements to make it more clear the context of the jobs. But usually the qualifications section, which is and the how you'll be evaluated section on USA Jobs, those are really where you'll see the competencies more in the KSAs that we're hiring for.
Excellent. The questions are starting to pop up now. So I'm going to throw this out to whoever wants to answer it. How would you define the difference between skills and competencies? Who wants to take that one?
You go first.
Sure. OPM define, and I will say, just with for full transparency, that I used to work at OPM and in the competency space and assessment space. So OPM defines competencies as the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need to perform the job successfully. So if you think about a knowledge, it's broader than a skill. So skills are typically things you can see someone doing, but competencies can include technical knowledge of a particular area. So the competencies are a little bit broader. Will, thoughts?
Nope. I was going to say knowledge, skills, and abilities. The skill is a sub piece of that. I think we can also think about competencies. We want to be able to define ranges of performance for those. How independent are you able to do this? At what scale can you do it? At what level of complexity are you able to do it? And sometimes that's easier to do when we format things as competencies versus like, I have done this verb, yes or no. It's also about the context.
Got it. Will, I'm going to direct this one to you.
Mm-hmm.
Signing assessments, do agencies determine a maximum amount of time that a candidate should spend on the hiring process? How do we balance the need to assess skills with the amount of unpaid time candidates can spend interviewing and taking assessments? Great question.
Yeah, so this is a balancing act. On the one hand, in some ways, an agency's incentives are served if you just put a massive gate and say, hey, whoever applies needs to spend 10 hours on this assessment. Well, you're really testing to see who really wants the job, but it's also not equitable or fair for people, especially you might imagine people that they're already employed. They have multiple children they're taking care of. It's not, we can't expect someone of that. And so there are maximums. There's not a formal rule that I know about, Andrea might correct me, that says like, you can't spend more than X amount of time. But what I would say is that you want to run a process where as the government is investing time, the candidate may also invest time. So looking at a resume, for example, we expect candidates already have those resumes in place. So that's a pretty low bar to say, hey, let's send us a resume. Maybe the government needs to review that resume first and say, okay, we see something that we're looking for. We're now going to assess that versus having every candidate be applied with something. The general rules of thumb I would follow is that no specific assessment should take longer than an hour. That both applies to work sample assessments where we might say, hey, here's a sample problem. You want to give people that guidance. Beware, some people will want to spend a lot more time in that way. And so you may still have a problem in a fair assessment if your assessment is such that someone that might spend 8 hours where someone else would spend 1. So how do you time box that in a way that's fair to everyone? Maybe by setting specific times or, some of the automated systems have limits. A structured interview is a very good way to do that because you can always say you have this much time, and those interviews are very fixed in terms of when they start and when they end, so that candidates all have the same time. And you're also able to measure in the structured interview, is someone able to manage their own time well, which is relevant for some roles.
Any additional thoughts, Andrea?
Just that this is probably a good area to get feedback from applicants, as they're going through the process, and even people who drop out of the process, to the extent that you can find out and get feedback for them. Sometimes they'll respond and tell you, yeah, I dropped out because it was just becoming too onerous a process. So find out from your applicants, have you pushed it too far?
Yes. Great. I have another question in the chat, and this is more about retention than recruitment. But she asks, how can a skills-based hire compete internally for promotions against their degree-holding counterparts? We get them through the door, but are we building frameworks and proper support channels to lower attrition? Great question. Andrea, thoughts?
Yeah. So hopefully, when we use assessments to get in the door, then it essentially the degree kind of becomes irrelevant. And I sort of hate to say that because I know that people invest a whole lot of time and energy in in attaining degrees. But the reason you're doing that and investing in the education is not to have the degree. So put the degree aside. The reason to do that investment in your education is to build the competencies. And whether those are for your own personal, development, because I'm fascinated by whatever it is, anthropology. I know someone who retired who's now going back and getting a degree in anthropology because she's fascinated by it. It's not for any purpose. And frankly, she doesn't care if she gets a degree because it's about gaining the competency and the knowledge and the skills. So really, someone without a degree can compete equally well. It's about finding other paths to gain those competencies. So you can, we talk in the federal government, you'll probably have all noticed if you've looked at our job announcements that there's a section where it says that this experience can be attained through paid or unpaid experience, because there used to be a perception that it only counted if you were getting paid and you were getting that experience in a job. Now there's recognition, okay, if you are the treasurer for your whatever nonprofit organization, you're volunteering on the side, you may be gaining financial knowledge, and that would be great experience that may transfer into serving as a budget person in a federal agency. So it's not the degree itself that matters, it's the skills and the competencies and that you have them, and you can get them lots of different ways.
That's terrific. Will, did you want to say anything?
I would just add that degrees are differently available to different people. Sometimes it's a thing that, if you have clarity and say, oh, of course I want to go get this degree. Sometimes you discover in the course of one's career, oh, this is a skill area that I'm very invested in. And I think that question is getting to a norm we might have in some workplaces that says, well, you need a degree to be able to rise to this kind of level. There's an underlying assumption about that job analysis can help to actually break through and say, okay, what is the thing in the degree that is providing the skill set where someone can function as a manager or a director or something like that? Let's actually talk about what that is. And then let's assess candidates for that specific thing, that skills-based hiring. And that can help break through some of those norms that people might have. You can also make an argument because, not all these degrees are very cheap to get. And so if you want to have a workforce that is able to represent the people that you're serving, if you have some of these norms, you can block yourself from getting that workforce you may want. So like thinking about it from that skills-based way can also mean your workforce ends up being more representative of the people that you might want to serve.
That's great. I'm watching the clock and I can't believe how quickly this time has gone. I want to make sure that each one of you have an opportunity for your kind of final words before the webinar ends. And so Will, I'm going to start with you. Are there any best practices or lessons learned that you want to make sure the audience hears before we close out today?
Just one piece of evidence to use is that we published our data and it's not always available. So you can go to smeqa.usds.gov/results and you can see what happened in our pilots. You can see the number of people that applied, the number that were found qualified, which was oftentimes not very many, and then the number of people that were ultimately hired, just to show it does and it can work to do things in a different way. So please make use of that data. The other comment I would make broadly is that this is not a topic where you need to necessarily try to change your entire organization's policy to try doing one pilot. Start with something and then learn from what it's like to try to recruit applicants in a different way, to then assess applicants, to write a different kind of job announcement, do a different type of recruiting, do a different type of assessment, and then see how those things fall through. The other big note, and this is just following from what Jenny said, you can do this much more cheaply if you're making multiple hires. So when you look for that pilot opportunity, where's a situation where you might need to hire 3 or 4 of someone? We spend an awful lot of time assessing many applicants to make one hire. Well, it's easily wasted. So what's something that you could do maybe if you work in a nonprofit or if you're working in a state government? Is there another bureau? Is there another office that needs someone with the same skill set? Let's share these lists of people that we've assessed the qualifications for so we can make good use of that time and spent assessment instead of kind of that being done. And then if you're in a state government, I would also say making sure that your certificate or your list of qualified people stays open and available. So let's say that you have an office of 10 people and you've just assessed a whole bunch of people and you've hired one. Keep that list ready so that if someone else announces that they're leaving 9 months later, you can go back to the list you already have. We have made successful hires a year after a job was first open. That's a much cheaper way to make a hire, is when you can work in those ways of scale.
Absolutely. I think we could have a whole other webinar on pooled hiring actions and shared certificates. That's for another day. Andrea, final thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, the first is sort of on the resource and investment side. The foundation of all this really is job analysis. And I feel like we said that a few times and we didn't directly say it, but I would say the foundation of all of this is job analysis and identifying those critical tasks for the job and then the competencies that are required to perform them. And that investment upfront really can be much broader than hiring. So we've been talking about hiring, but those are the same competencies and the same job tasks that can inform your career development, your training, your performance management. So once you have that information, it really is more valuable than just this. So if you think of it as the job analysis as a bigger investment, it may help a little bit to offset some of those upfront investments of time and resources, really. And the last thing I have to throw out is that, as always, CBP is hiring. So since Will threw out the SMEEK website, I will throw out ours. It is cbp.gov/careers. And in addition to the fact that we are hiring, there's a lot of information there where you can see examples of the type of guides and things that we provide about the assessments that we conduct that may be helpful for others who are developing something similar.
That's great. I love that. Thank you both so much. I know that you are both very, very busy people, and so we're grateful for your time, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. Nicole, I'm going to pass it back to you.
I want to thank the Partnership for Public Service for hosting this webinar with us, and we're so thankful for Jenny, Michelle, Assistant Commissioner Bright, and Will for being such incredible speakers and sharing your insights and expertise with us today. I also want to give a huge thank you to all of the webinar attendees for your engagement and participation. Please know that you'll receive a follow-up email that will include a recording of today's webinar, as well as our registration links for our upcoming events and other links that were shared today. So we hope you found today's session valuable. We encourage you to take the survey after the webinar. We'd love to hear from you. And we hope to see you all back at our October office hours. And we look forward to continuing these important conversations. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.